now see the benefits of a coalition government with Karzai that would retain Western aid, legitimacy, and support. The second round of talks with the Taliban took place in Doha, the capital of Qatar, on February 15, 2011. It was delayed due to the tragic death of Richard Holbrooke on December 13, 2010. The American officials, still highly mistrustful, asked Agha to prove that he had access to Mullah Omar and other leaders by getting the Taliban to deliver on a confidence-building measure that they proposed. The Americans asked Agha to see that the Taliban officially put out a certain public statement in language that had been agreed upon. A few weeks later, the participants received the long-awaited confirmation, a Taliban statement containing the agreed language. Agha had delivered, confirming that he spoke on behalf of the Taliban leadership. 3 days after the Doha meeting, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in the most significant U.S. public statement to date, told New York's Asia Society that we are launching a diplomatic surge to move this conflict toward a political outcome that shatters the alliance between the Taliban and al-Qaeda, ends the insurgency, and helps to produce not only a more stable Afghanistan, but a more stable region. It was the first tantalizing public hint that the United States was talking to the Taliban. She went on to eulogize Holbrooke, saying, "We had always envisioned Richard Holbrooke leading this effort. He was an architect of our integrated military-civilian diplomatic strategy." A third round with the same participants took place in the same Bavarian village on May 7, 2011. Osama bin Laden had been killed in Pakistan, and Agha expressed no regret at his death. The Americans agreed to talk about the possibility of opening a Taliban office in Doha so that more frequent talks could take place. The Taliban had been lobbying for an office outside Pakistan for more than a year. Turkey had been mooted, but the Taliban preferred Qatar. But the four parties still had to agree on the legal modalities that the office would have, while Pakistan had to be persuaded to allow the Taliban to travel freely to Qatar. This was particularly difficult because the Pakistanis, who were informed late about the dialogue, resented being neither the host nor an invited guest. As a confidence-building measure, the Americans agreed to remove a large number of Taliban from the UN sanctions list that designated them as global terrorists. The list, called UN Security Council Resolution 1267, was first drawn up in 1999 and had 433 names on it, including 140 Taliban. The sanctions included a travel ban and an assets freeze. The entire UN Security Council had to give its agreement for any changes, which took considerable time. Some 45 Taliban names were removed in December 2010, and another 50 were requested to be removed in 2011. On June 17, 2011, in an important step, the UN Security Council decided to treat al-Qaeda and the Taliban separately, and to create two separate lists. It was now much easier to scrub Taliban names from the list. President Karzai, for his part, freed several Taliban prisoners from detention in Kabul. The Taliban then asked the Americans to free several of their leaders held at Guantanamo, including 3 top military commanders who had been held since 2002, Nurullah Nuri, Mullah Fazl, and former Interior Minister Mullah Khairullah Kharkhwa. But they could not be released because a new U.S. law prevented terrorism prisoners being removed from Guantanamo. The Taliban also demanded an end to night raids by American special forces that had killed hundreds of low-level commanders, fighters, and civilians, but the U.S. military refused to make any military concessions as yet. In Kabul in late 2010, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, the former Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, spelled out the short-term Taliban objectives to me. The fundamental problem is between the United States and the Taliban. The Afghan government is the secondary problem. The talks we want must involve the international community and end with international guarantees. The Taliban want to discuss the system of government that will prevail after peace comes. They are not interested in sharing of power, or to be in the government. It is best for our own safety to open an office in a third country so we can have a single address to meet with anyone we choose. Clearly the Taliban were serious about negotiating at least a reduction in the violence, if not an end to the fighting. The German-led peace process had begun with Steiner's predecessor, the diplomat Bernd Mützelberg, who was the German AFPAC envoy until May 2010. An Afghan-born German citizen who knew Syed Tayyab Agha had contacted Mützelberg and told him that if the Germans were interested in talking to the Taliban, he could arrange it. Mützelberg and Tayyab Agha had their first secret meeting in Dubai in September 2009. Mützelberg's first task was to confirm Agha's identity and that he had access to the Taliban leadership. He had a number of meetings with Agha, building trust and an understanding of what the Taliban wanted. In February 2010, after being sure about Agha's identity, Mützelberg conferred with Holbrooke. After that, the results of each meeting were reported to the Americans and to Karzai. Steiner held 2 more meetings with Agha in the Gulf before the Americans were ready to come to the table. Steiner was convinced of the Taliban's sincerity, in part because Agha never asked for money, and beyond a few travel expenses, the Germans did not pay him a penny. Steiner had asked the United States to guarantee that Agha would not be harassed while traveling from Pakistan to the Gulf. He got this guarantee, demonstrating early White House support for the talks. Although only a few U.S. officials knew about the talks, the power play in Washington among senior officials who supported or rejected them remained a major problem. The Germans could move no faster than the Americans were able to, and the Americans moved very slowly. The Germans frequently asked the Americans to speed up the process, especially as Chancellor Angela Merkel was following it closely. When she invited me to dinner in Berlin, she peppered me with questions about the prospects for peace in Afghanistan. The Taliban's first demand was the release of their prisoners held by the Americans. When the United States was unable to deliver prisoners held in Guantanamo, Steiner went to Karzai. If they could not deliver on the first confidence-building measure that the Taliban asked for, the talks might collapse. Karzai said he would free some Taliban prisoners as a unilateral gesture, a step that generated enormous goodwill from the Taliban. The International Committee of the Red Cross was brought in to facilitate the prisoners' release. When the time came to talk to the Americans, the Taliban set down 2 conditions on a single sheet of paper. The first was that the talks remain top secret. No leaks or revelations would take place, or the dialogue would be broken off. The second condition was that no Taliban members who took part in the talks would be arrested or harassed. Ultimately, all the participants knew that the talks would be later transformed into an Afghan-led process. The Taliban, from their side, also asked that a representative from the Qatari royal family be present at all meetings. The Taliban considered Qatar to be neutral because it had never interfered in Afghanistan's affairs. Both the American and the German leaders had excellent relations with the Emir of Qatar, as the world was to see later, when Qatar joined NATO to help Libyans free themselves from the Muammar Gaddafi regime. The United States agreed to these conditions, and the stage was set for the first meeting outside Munich. In May 2011, after the 3rd round of talks, a series of leaks about the talks appeared in the U.S. and German press. This posed an immediate problem for Agha, as he was named as the Taliban interlocutor. The leaks came from some of Karzai's ministers who were opposed to the talks, and from American officials in both the State Department and the Pentagon who were opposed to the talks. The leaks disturbed the talks, and the 4th round was not held until August. There was an agreement that a Taliban office could open soon in Doha, but its legal position had yet to be worked out. The leaks prompted the Germans and the Americans to level with the Pakistanis and the ISI for the first time in May and June 2011. U.S. officials met with General Kayani in Rawalpindi, telling him about the contacts with the Taliban and asking him to protect Agha. Kayani promised to do so, but he knew about the talks already. He and ISI chief Ahmed Shuja Pasha were angry that their Western allies had gone behind their backs to make contact with the Taliban. This was the role that the ISI had always wanted to play: offer the Americans talks with the Taliban, thereby demonstrating Pakistan's importance in any future settlement. The Pakistanis were doubly angry with the Taliban, who had shown that they were not fully under their control. The ISI became convinced that the United States wanted to undermine it by cutting the one hand it had to play, bringing the Taliban to the table. Paradoxically, the Pakistan Army's relations with the Americans and the Taliban worsened at the same time. But more of this later. Talking to the Taliban was far from a new idea. Lakhdar Brahimi and Francesc Vendrell, the UN mediators who had negotiated the Bonn Agreement, establishing a provisional government in Afghanistan after the U.S. invasion a decade earlier, in 2001, had soon afterward admitted that their biggest mistake had been omitting the Taliban from the table at Bonn. Including them might well have achieved a peace that avoided the revival of the Taliban insurgency in 2003, but at the time, the Americans were not interested. The first peace offer came in 2002, just after the Taliban's defeat, from a group of senior Taliban including Agha and the movement's number 2, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. The group wrote a letter to Karzai accepting his nomination as president and expressing a willingness to surrender if they received immunity from arrest. Both Karzai and Baradar came from the same Popalzai tribe of the Durrani Pashtuns in Kandahar. The United States and the Northern Alliance, which dominated his cabinet, told Karzai to ignore the offer. Subsequent attempts by other Taliban groups to talk to Kabul were also squashed, either by infighting within the Taliban or by the ISI, which wanted to exercise control over any talks that the United States might decide to hold with Taliban dissidents. Karzai continued to hanker after an accord with the Taliban, as he quickly understood that a military victory against the Taliban was not possible as long as their safe havens remained in Pakistan. The United States was unwilling to put pressure on Pakistan, but continued to discourage Karzai from pursuing any dialogue with the Taliban. He also did not have the full support of his cabinet colleagues. Nevertheless, he persisted, and in 2005 he set up a Peace and Reconciliation Commission, headed by the aged former Prime Minister and Mujahideen leader Sibghatullah Mujahidi. Its aim was to lure moderate or disgruntled Taliban out of the movement and help them resettle as peaceful citizens by offering them jobs. But the committee had neither funds, nor a plan, nor sufficiently talented staff to make the project successful. Holding more direct contacts with the Taliban became the domain of two of the president's brothers, Qayyum Karzai, a member of parliament and a businessman, and Ahmed Wali Karzai, the powerful head of the provincial council in Kandahar, and a key interlocutor with the U.S. military and the CIA. Both brothers had been quietly talking to local Taliban field commanders and, through them, to Mullah Baradar. With Mullah Omar rarely making an appearance, the all-powerful deputy emir of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as Baradar was now titled, was virtually commander-in-chief, head of treasury and political leader of the Taliban movement. He had been a founding member of the Taliban in 1994 and had fought under Omar's command against the Soviets in the late 1980s, so Omar and Baradar trusted each other implicitly. Baradar's main rival for the deputy slot, the bloodthirsty Mullah Dadullah Akhund, who had restarted the insurgency in 2003 from Pakistan, had been killed in a U.S. raid in May 2007, leaving Baradar as the unquestioned leader. But serious talks could not take place inside Afghanistan, which was a constant battlefield, and where the Americans gave no guarantees of safety. Nor could they occur in Pakistan, where the Taliban leaders were afraid of being harassed or arrested by the ISI. They did not want to engage in a dialogue where they appeared to be under the ISI's control. In 2008, Karzai reached out to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the notorious head of Hezb-e-Islami and a Taliban ally, who was based in Pakistan. Hezb's influence in Afghanistan was in no way comparable to that of the Taliban or the network of Jalaluddin Haqqani among the eastern Pashtuns. Hezb had some influence among Pashtun intellectual circles, although many Hezb figures had abandoned the party and joined the Kabul regime. In the 2005 elections, 35 Hezb figures were elected to the Afghan parliament, the largest single group in parliament, and some 200 officials in the Afghan bureaucracy were also former Hezb. All these people would benefit if Hekmatyar came to an understanding with Karzai. The ISI considered Hekmatyar more pliable and dependent on Pakistani support than the Taliban. Karzai exchanged letters with Hekmatyar in 2008 and released his son-in-law, Hayrat Bahir, from a Kabul jail in May. Bahir then met with Karzai, UN officials in Kabul, and other diplomats, but the Americans stayed well away from these contacts. Karzai fully understood that without the Taliban, peace with Hekmatyar was next to useless. In 2008, he wrote to Saudi King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, asking him to use his influence with the Taliban and provide a venue for talks. The task was given to Prince Mukrin bin Abdulaziz, the head of Saudi intelligence, while an important initiative was also taken by Abdullah Anas, an Algerian Islamist who had once worked with bin Laden, had fought in the Afghan war against the Soviets, was married to the daughter of Abdullah Azam, the mentor of bin Laden, and was eventually given political asylum in Britain. Anas used his former Saudi, al-Qaeda, and Afghan contacts to approach the Taliban. The Saudis at first insisted that the Taliban denounce al-Qaeda before they came to the table, but this demand was seen as an end condition to talks rather than a precondition. At the request of the Taliban, the Saudis had also kept Pakistan out of the process, much to the chagrin of the ISI. Saudi intelligence, a close ally of the ISI, had itself become mistrustful of the ISI for continuing to tolerate on Pakistani soil militants and al-Qaeda, whom the Saudis were battling. A series of meetings took place in Jeddah during the fasting month of Ramadan and the festival of Eid in September and October 2008. Those present included Afghan officials from Kabul, Afghan legislators including Qayyum Karzai, and former Taliban, retired figures rather than those active in the Taliban's leadership council. Nevertheless, the Saudis had secret contacts with senior active Taliban, including Baradar. Ultimately, this initiative fizzled out, because the Saudis did not know how to take it forward. They mistrusted the Afghans, and having just defeated al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, their heart was not in this difficult task. Meetings between Karzai's brothers and some Taliban leaders, including Agha, continued in Dubai, which were supported by the United Arab Emirates, but they did not move the process forward. By the spring of 2009, U.S. and NATO military commanders had finally accepted the need for a better-funded reintegration policy that would take willing Taliban off the battlefield by offering them money, jobs, and resettlement. In the process, the false idea emerged that there were so-called moderate Taliban as opposed to extremist Taliban, a distinction that disregarded the Taliban's basis of loyalty to its leaders and their fervent belief in the cause of expelling a foreign army of occupation. Taliban commanders would not surrender because it would require them to accept an Afghan government that they considered a stooge of the United States, and, second, to break their oath of fealty to Mullah Omar, which they declined to do. Even those Taliban who were in prison or retired refused to break with or denounce Mullah Omar. But the U.S. military's assessment was that 70% of the Taliban could be reintegrated because they were young, jobless men fighting for money or other practical, i.e., non-ideological reasons. According to this U.S. analysis, only about 1,000 fighters, or 5%, were hardline religious ideologues who would not settle for peace. But in the next 3 years, despite concerted attempts and lavish funds, only 2,700 Taliban availed themselves of the amnesty program. The American mistake at the time was to endorse reintegration but not reconciliation or talking to the Taliban. For the U.S. military, the template was still Iraq, where Sunni insurgents had been peeled away successfully from al-Qaeda, itself a Sunni organization that had committed terrible excesses. They believed that the Taliban could be peeled away from their leaders in the same way, but the conditions and the forms of tribal society in Afghanistan were very different from those in Iraq. At another international conference on Afghanistan, this time in London on January 28, 2010, the international community announced a new Peace and Reintegration Trust Fund of $140 million for reintegrating Taliban. A flurry of international activity around reintegration led nowhere. Reintegration could work only if it was part of reconciliation. Mullah Baradar issued a withering riposte to President Obama for trying to peel away Taliban rather than talk to them. We remind Obama to avoid wasting your time on ways which are not pragmatic, but focus on ways which provide a down-to-earth and realistic solution to this issue of talks, Baradar said in November 2009. Pull all your forces out of our honorable country and put an end to the game of colonization. In Washington, the idea of talking to the Taliban became more acceptable, largely due to the efforts of Richard Holbrooke, his deputy Frank Ruggiero, his advisor on Afghanistan Barnett Rubin, and Douglas Lute at the National Security Council, who all battled to win over other parts of the U.S. government. Holbrooke's successor, Mark Grossman, also quickly became deeply involved in the talks process. In Europe, there was stronger public pressure on governments to talk to the Taliban and seek a political settlement to end the war. Success will not be achieved by military means alone, British Foreign Secretary David Miliband told an American audience. He asked the Americans for a workable reconciliation strategy and urged the Afghan government to pursue a political settlement with as much vigor and energy as we are pursuing the military and civilian effort. Such speeches showed that Europe was way ahead of the Americans in wanting a quick resolution to the war. The British had repeatedly tried to get the Taliban to talk, but had blundered badly in November 2010, when MI6, the British Secret Service, brought a supposed Taliban leader, Mullah Akhtar Mohammad Mansour, to Kabul for talks, only to discover he was an impostor who charged the British $65,000 for every one of the 3 trips he made to Kabul. It is still not known whether the ISI or the Taliban perpetrated the fraud, but its discovery led to severe humiliation and embarrassment for Britain and NATO. Norway had established its own secret dialogue with a representative of the Taliban, but did not ask the Americans to join. The UN's Special Representative for Afghanistan, Staffan de Mistura, had expected the Americans to empower him in a mediating role, but Washington decided to do without the UN, even though Mistura's predecessor, Kai Ida, had earlier met with Taliban representatives. In June 2010, Karzai held a national consultative peace jirga, which aimed to bring all ethnic groups together to establish a national consensus for peace talks with the Taliban. But there were significant absences among the non-Pashtuns. The Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras did not believe in talking to the Taliban. In September, Karzai constituted a 70-member High Peace Council headed by the Tajik religious leader and former president Burhanuddin Rabbani, which was tasked to negotiate with the Taliban. Once again, the group was supposed to be representative of all ethnic groups and women, but many of its members were former warlords whom the Taliban and the public despised. Karzai never fulfilled his promise to expand the national dialogue to include members of civil society, women, and minorities. Instead of expanding the national conversation about reconciliation, Karzai has narrowed the avenues of public participation, wrote one expert. Once the Lisbon summit set a withdrawal date for 2014, all the neighboring countries set in motion what everyone had feared, a battle for influence in Afghanistan. Separately, Pakistan and Iran wanted to ensure that when U.S. forces pulled out, they would shape the region's future. But the most dangerous source of instability was the escalation of the proxy war between India and Pakistan over future influence in Afghanistan. I will deal with the regional challenge in Chapter 9. For the ISI, what was most important was to try to keep control of the peace process and any talks with the Taliban. On February 8, 2010, the ISI infuriated Karzai by arresting Mullah Baradar in Karachi, along with a dozen senior Taliban figures who were loyal to him. It was a joint ISI-CIA operation, but senior Pakistani military officials told me later that the real reason for his arrest was not to please the Americans, but rather the ISI's conviction that Baradar had held secret talks with the Americans and had received a $5 million bribe from the CIA without informing the ISI. In fact, Baradar had only been talking to Karzai's brothers and would never have double-crossed Mullah Omar by talking to the Americans. With these measures, the Pakistani military de facto claimed a veto on all negotiations with the Taliban and therefore on Afghanistan's political future, wrote Thomas Ruttig. The UN representative Kai Ida later called his arrest a devastating blow, saying, "There was no doubt in my mind that the ISI had taken action to prevent the continuation of such discussions." Taliban leaders in Pakistan went underground. Talks between Kabul and the Taliban stopped, and relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan worsened. In March, when Karzai visited Islamabad, he told me he had bluntly told the Pakistanis that they were sabotaging and undermining my efforts to talk to the Taliban. The Pakistani military angrily told him that if he wanted Pakistani cooperation, he should reduce Indian influence in Afghanistan by shutting down the Indian consulates in Kandahar and Jalalabad, which bordered Pakistan. Pakistan was making it clear that it wanted to direct any talks with the Taliban and that it wanted something in return for doing so. Within days, the Indians in Kabul were under attack. On February 26th, a suicide attack on 2 Kabul guest houses killed 16 people, including 7 Indian doctors and nurses and 2 army majors. Afghan and Indian officials accused Jalaluddin Haqqani's network and the Punjabi group Lashkar-e-Taiba, which was now cooperating with Haqqani and al-Qaeda, of carrying out the attack. Later, U.S. officials said that the attackers had been in direct contact with ISI officers in Pakistan. Despite ISI denials, the governments of neighboring countries read the attack as a clear signal that the Pakistani military would protect its interests. Pakistan's obvious attempts to control any peace process among the United States, Kabul, and the Taliban were, in fact, reducing its influence and leading all the regional and Western powers to mistrust its intentions. The attempt to isolate India from Afghanistan, where it had spent over $1.5 billion in development aid, was short-sighted, as the United States, Europe, and Japan, the major aid donors to Afghanistan, rated India as a strategic ally and a major aid donor. Nevertheless, as I will describe in Chapter 9, India's interests in Afghanistan were hardly benign, but were intended to keep Pakistan under pressure. But for a long time, India, Iran, and Russia were averse to any U.S. or Karzai-led talks with the Taliban because they saw such a process as only giving Pakistan greater leverage in the region. Pakistan still holds many of the Taliban cards. Although Taliban leaders want to go home, after long years of exile, many of them have put down roots with their families in the border towns of Pakistan. They have bought property, set up businesses and shops, and run bus services, all of which makes them vulnerable to the ISI, which has not hesitated to arrest entire Taliban families and clans in order to put pressure on certain commanders. In Pakistan, the ISI allows the Taliban to have the supply and support network that they need to sustain their war effort, as well as a constant pool of Afghan and Pakistani recruits. Many of the suicide bombers used in Afghanistan are Pakistani, while the majority are trained in Pakistan. Moreover, the ISI allows a stream of Pashtun and Punjabi militants to fight for the Afghan Taliban. The Pakistan Army, in its operations in the tribal areas, has never attacked those Pakistani groups or militants who are prepared to fight the Americans in Afghanistan, but who decline to fight the Pakistan Army, something that constantly irks the United States and NATO. Pakistan also has another reliable card, the network run by Jalaluddin Haqqani, which is based in Miranshah in North Waziristan. Haqqani, over 60 years old and now bedridden, comes from the Khost district of eastern Afghanistan and was an elder of his tribe, the Zadran. His family migrated to Pakistan in 1971, and he took part in the 1975 Islamic uprising against Afghan President Mohammad Daoud Khan. He fiercely resisted the Soviets and set up a Zadran-led battlefront stretching across several eastern provinces that the CIA and ISI armed and supplied with funds. In the civil war in the 1990s, at the behest of the ISI, he sided with the Taliban and became a minister in their government in 1996. But throughout, he retained his independence and his close links to the ISI and to al-Qaeda. After 9/11, he refused to join the anti-Taliban alliance, although both the CIA and the ISI approached him to do so. Later, he helped al-Qaeda militants escape from Afghanistan, gave them refuge in Miranshah, and set up a separate front to fight U.S. forces, although remaining nominally loyal to Mullah Omar. The Haqqanis became multimillionaires from their legitimate businesses in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also profited from kidnapping, extortion, and protection rackets for construction and transport firms that received U.S. aid money. Pakistan tried hard to promote Haqqani and his sons Sirajuddin and Badruddin as the Taliban leaders to hold talks with, but initially the Americans demurred because of his hand in many suicide attacks against U.S. targets, and in particular his involvement in a suicide bombing that killed 7 CIA officers at a U.S. base near Khost in December 2009. The ISI did succeed in persuading Karzai to hold talks with Haqqani representatives in 2010, which resulted in a pledge by them not to attack Kabul, although that ceasefire lasted only 9 months. It was a significant effort by Karzai and the ISI that did not involve the Americans, but the short-lived ceasefire did not produce any substantial talks between Karzai and the Haqqani clan. The ISI appeared reluctant to push Haqqani into talks with Karzai. Rather, it waited for the Americans to come on board. Instead, in every meeting that Admiral Mullen had with General Kayani, he urged the Pakistanis to break with the Haqqanis and go after them, which was highly unlikely given the commitment the Pakistanis and the Haqqanis had to each other. Jalaluddin Haqqani is also the only Taliban leader to publicly allude to the threat that Pakistan faces from India, something that has obviously endeared him to the Pakistanis. Just after September 11, 2001, Haqqani said, "On Pakistan's eastern border is India, Pakistan's perennial enemy. With the Taliban government in Afghanistan, Pakistan has an unbeatable 2,300-kilometer strategic depth. Does Pakistan really want a new government, which will include pro-India people in it, thereby wiping out this strategic depth?" The U.S. military, and especially Admiral Mullen, tried hard to persuade General Kayani to break links with Haqqani. But in 2011, the Haqqanis are working closely with Punjabi militant groups, including Lashkar-e-Taiba, that have been allowed to set up camps in North Waziristan. In 2009, when it became apparent that the Quetta Shura, or mainstream Taliban, were trying to start secret talks with the Americans and Karzai, bypassing Pakistan, the ISI came to depend more on the Haqqani network for its loyalty to Pakistan, its successful military operations, and its potential as a partner for talks with Karzai. The Quetta Shura is the name given to the Council of Taliban leaders and elders, many of whom, after 2001, settled in and around Quetta, the capital of Baluchistan province. From here they would enter and leave Afghanistan. The Haqqani network claims to be part of the Quetta Shura and operating under the Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar, but the Americans assume that the Haqqani network is autonomous in deciding its targets for attacks on U.S. forces. The U.S. military and the CIA have been decidedly less enthusiastic than the diplomatic side about talks with the Taliban. The military would prefer to stay on the offensive for as long as possible, or at least until 2014, which could entail another 2 years of intense conflict. Meanwhile, Karzai sees his political survival as depending on ending the war as soon as possible through talks. In December 2010, I pointed out to General Petraeus that the more Taliban the Americans kill, the more he will radicalize the movement, bringing in younger and more militant commanders who owe nothing to the older leadership and who will be easier for al-Qaeda to manipulate. But he remained firm in his belief that the Taliban could be broken, fragmented, and split off, one by one. In the summer of 2011, the U.S. military saturation of the South prevented any major Taliban guerrilla attacks, except for another successful jailbreak in Kandahar in April, when 476 Taliban escaped after tunneling under the jail wall and a major highway. Instead, the Taliban carried out high-profile assassinations of Afghan officials, a policy intended to terrify and paralyze the Afghan government. On May 28, 2011, a suicide bomber killed General Daoud Daoud, the charismatic and popular police chief in northern Afghanistan. Major General Marcus Knipe, the head of German forces in the north, was wounded in the attack, and 2 German soldiers were killed. In August 2011, the ISI persuaded the CIA to meet with a representative of the Haqqani network in Dubai, but clearly nothing evolved, as a month later the U.S. Embassy in Kabul was attacked by the Haqqanis. But the most devastating murder was that of the Tajik religious leader and former president Burhanuddin Rabbani at his home in Kabul on September 20th. Rabbani had headed the High Peace Council that was negotiating with the Taliban on behalf of Karzai. It was not clear which Taliban group carried out the killing, but it resulted in a suspension of talks, a massive loss of prestige for Karzai and his dialogue initiative, a rise in Tajik and other minority anger and activism against the Afghan Pashtuns and Pakistan, and thus a widening of the ethnic divide. There will always be spoilers who will try to derail the talks, but the death of Rabbani holds the direst implications. Peace will have to be built layer upon layer, district by district and group by group, in the Afghan way, rather than through grand conferences. Despite the violence, the faster all sides, including the U.S. military, can develop confidence-building measures and act on them, the faster the peace process will develop. Providing an office for the Taliban negotiators would be a major step. But ultimately, with Western forces leaving Afghanistan and the weak Kabul government clearly unable to carry out its responsibilities, only an end to the violence and a political deal with the Taliban can ensure the survival of the Afghan state. The future of Afghanistan and the region depends on whether that will be possible or renewed civil war will follow the Western withdrawal. Chapter 7. A Sliver of Hope. Counterinsurgency in Swat. Making my way to President Asif Ali Zardari's presidential palace in the heart of Islamabad for dinner in June 2009 was like running an obstacle course. Pakistan's once sleepy capital, full of restaurant-going bureaucrats and diplomats, was now littered with concrete barriers, blast walls, checkpoints, armed police and soldiers. As a result of recent suicide bombings, the city resembled Baghdad or Kabul. At the first checkpoint 2 miles from the palace, they had my name and my car's license number. I had 7 more checkpoints to negotiate along the way. Apart from traveling to the airport by helicopter to go abroad, the president stays inside the palace these days. He fears threats to his life by the Pakistani Taliban, by Al-Qaeda, and even by the intelligence services. Every day he remembers his wife's murder at the hands of perpetrators whom nobody has yet fully identified. Zardari's isolation and insecurity only add to his growing unpopularity, his indecisiveness, his fear of making decisions without the military's consent, and his hopeless disconnect from the public mood. Zardari has also become a know-it-all, refusing to listen to advice, asking nobody's opinion, and talking non-stop even to visiting dignitaries. Corruption scandals, like those that dogged him in the 1990s and put him in jail for over a decade, are once again rife in the Islamabad rumor mill, although the corruption stories now extend to his chosen Prime Minister, Yusuf Raza Gilani, and his wife and children. Zardari has totally sidelined the senior figures in the Pakistan People's Party, who were close to his wife, and replaced them with his old friends and business cronies, many of them tainted by corruption. Zardari has become an excellent behind-the-scenes wheeler-dealer, enlarging his coalition government by bringing in new political parties in order to undermine his old rival Nawaz Sharif, whose younger brother Shahbaz controls Punjab. Important national decisions are delayed or never made as the country slips into chaos. Pakistan's entire top leadership, Zardari, Gilani, and General Kayani, are in a state of denial about the reality of what Pakistan is becoming. They have begun to take violence and chaos for granted. We are not a failed state yet, but we may become one in 10 years if we don't receive international support to combat the Taliban threat, Zardari told me indignantly, pointing out that the United States had given Musharraf $11 billion between 2002 and 2008, but he had received only a pittance. We have no money to arm the police or fund development, give jobs or revive the economy. What are we supposed to do? Zardari believes that the United States owes it to Pakistan to bail it out with billions of dollars. But the government does not accept the need for improving governance, undertaking economic reform, increasing direct taxes, or raising greater revenue at home, which are the main demands of the international community. One Western ambassador told Zardari bluntly that there is no free lunch. Why should our taxpayers pay for you when neither you nor your elite pay taxes? Zardari always has an excuse for not reforming, invariably related to his own political survival and the need for stability. Nobody has a strategic plan for combating Islamic extremism or disarming the extremists. There is no debate between the president and the generals over the continued presence of the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan. Zardari's view is that since the army and the ISI nurtured the extremists, it is they who should deal with them and take responsibility for them before the Americans. Consequently, there is no internal debate, no civilian voice trying to persuade the army to change course on its foreign policy, and no political government is dedicating itself to improving people's lives. After 8 years of military rule, Pakistanis crave good governance, competence, and honesty from a democratic government that will help change the army's way of thinking. To date, it has not happened. The figures speak volumes about the precarious nature of the state. In 2009, Pakistani civilian deaths at the hands of insurgents rose to 3,021, for the first time topping the number of civilians, 2,412 killed in Afghanistan, and 33% more than those killed the previous year in Pakistan. Another 7,300 people were wounded. A staggering 87 suicide attacks took place in 2009, the largest number to date, as well as 67 sectarian attacks that killed mainly Shia Muslims. Pakistan's Human Rights Commission reported that in Karachi alone, during the year, 747 people were gunned down, including 7 journalists. In Baluchistan province, where a 5-year insurgency is underway, 118 civilians and 158 security personnel were killed. Pakistan is already on the edge of a precipice. Killings, mayhem, and the breakdown of state control spread across the country, while the government seems to ignore it all. Everywhere one looked in the spring of 2009, a sense of unreality prevailed, with the government denying there was any risk. Even as the Pakistani Taliban were storming southward from their mountain bases in Fatah, Prime Minister Gilani told Parliament that they posed no threat, and there was nothing to worry about. Interior Minister Rehman Malik deliberately lied when he claimed that the Afghan government, India, and Russia were backing the Pakistani Taliban. The economy was spiraling out of control with drastic power cuts, industry shutdowns, and rising unemployment. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, state institutions had been shut down or paralyzed for more than a year. 1 million people had fled their homes, and the provincial government in Peshawar had gone into hiding because of assassination threats. In the first 3 months of 2009, there were 200 kidnappings for ransom in Peshawar, yet Pakistanis were still told that all was well. Meanwhile, the various tribal militias that made up the Pakistani Taliban were coalescing into a new organization. On December 12, 2007, in North Waziristan, some 40 tribal leaders who commanded separate militias had met to form the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or Movement of the Pakistani Taliban. They chose a young militant, Baitullah Masood, as their leader. Their stated objective was to unite their militias and establish a centralized organization, fight NATO forces in Afghanistan, and wage a defensive jihad against the Pakistan Army. They claimed to have 40,000 men under their command. Their early successes and hold on territory attracted young extremists from the Punjab and Sindh, all determined to topple the government. The goal of the Pakistani Taliban in the summer of 2009 was to capture the scenic Swat Valley and its adjoining districts, just 90 miles north of Islamabad. Over the past 3 years, the Taliban movement in Swat had grown enormously, its ranks swelled by Afghans, Central Asians, Al-Qaeda, and tribesmen from Fatah. The army had twice tried and failed to oust them from Swat. In 2008, just 3,000 Taliban drove 12,000 troops out of Swat, blew up 100 girls' schools and other public buildings, and caused the mass exodus of 1/3 of Swat's 2 million people. In 2009, in a sign of abject defeat, the KP provincial government signed a controversial deal allowing the Taliban to impose Sharia law in Swat's courts in return for the Pakistan Army's withdrawal from Swat. As expected, the Taliban imposed their brutal interpretation of Sharia, a code of conduct that has taken on the weight of law. It allows for executions, floggings, and destruction of people's homes and girls' schools. Pakistanis were shocked when videos of Taliban brutalities appeared on YouTube. Yet Zardari had Parliament approve the implementation of Sharia on April 14th without even a debate. Within days, thousands of new Taliban arrived in Swat, taking control of the local administration, police stations, and schools, which was not part of the deal. On April 19th, Sufi Muhammad, a longtime radical preacher from Swat, who had led his followers to fight the Americans in Afghanistan in 2001 and had subsequently been jailed and freed, declared that democracy, the legal system, and civil society should be disbanded, since they were all systems of infidels. His son-in-law, Maulana Qazi Fazlullah, had become the undisputed leader of the SWAT Taliban. A former ski lift operator and self-appointed mullah, Fazlullah had spread his message over FM radio stations for the past 3 years without the army trying to stop him. American officials were in a state of panic, while Pakistanis berated the government for its lack of action. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton bluntly said in Baghdad on April 25th, "One of our concerns is that if the worst, the unthinkable, were to happen, and this advancing Taliban were to essentially topple the government for failure to beat them back, then they would have the keys to the nuclear arsenal of Pakistan. We can't even contemplate that." Defense Secretary Robert Gates and Admiral Mullen issued similar dire statements. A furious General Kayani responded that the army was fully capable of defending the country. Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban were eager to expand out of Fatah into KP's settled areas, where more facilities and better communications are available. The Swat Valley is a beautiful tourist destination, but also a strategic transit route. To the east it opens into Indian Kashmir, and to the west into Afghanistan. It is conveniently out of range of U.S. drone strikes. Capturing Swat would give the Taliban and Al-Qaeda control over northern Pakistan and roads that run to all the major cities, including Islamabad, as well as a new route to the battlefields of Kashmir and Afghanistan. A confident Fazlullah even invited Osama bin Laden to come and live in Swat under his protection. On April 21st, the Taliban moved into Swat's adjoining districts of Bunair, Shangla, and Dir, from where they threatened several major towns in the province. The politicians finally began to address the issue, and Parliament passed a resolution declaring full support for an army offensive against the militants. General Kayani said he had been waiting for just such a political endorsement before he moved in the army. On April 28th, President Obama called a meeting of his cabinet to discuss the crisis in Swat. He said he was gravely concerned, and that the civilian government right now is very fragile. It was the strongest statement Obama had yet made about the security of Pakistan. On May 7th, after forcing the evacuation of most of the population, the Pakistan Army launched a major air and ground offensive in Swat, dropping bombs and firing artillery around Mingora, where an estimated 4,000 Taliban fighters had dug in. Some 30,000 troops, or 3 times the number of those used in 2 earlier offensives, moved into Swat, in the largest operation ever undertaken against the Pakistani Taliban. For the first time, troops were drawn from the Indian border, after India pledged not to heighten tensions with Pakistan. The army had sufficient numbers and air power, while troop morale and motivation were high on account of the atrocities the Taliban had committed against soldiers. The operation had public support and international help, as the UN and other aid agencies dealt with the huge humanitarian crisis. By June, the army had pushed the Taliban militants out of the Swat Valley in fierce fighting that left more than 300 soldiers and 2,000 militants killed and hundreds more injured. The leaders of the Swat Taliban managed to escape to Fatah and Afghanistan, but some 1.5 million refugees from Swat, who had fled the valley earlier, finally started going back home. It had been the worst internal displacement in the country's history. The Americans were pleased, and Admiral Mullen felt he was finally making headway with Kayani and the Army. Kayani had agreed to rotate all Army units through a 6-week course on counterinsurgency taught by Pakistani officers, while 200 U.S. and British officers were allowed to conduct a Train the Trainers program for the Frontier Corps, FC. American Special Forces built up a new 700-man FC commando force. The 60,000-man FC received the latest counterterrorism equipment as part of a U.S. military aid program. Their salaries were raised, and medical care on the battlefield was provided. The war in Swat was the first, and so far the only, time the Pakistani army successfully completed a counterinsurgency campaign according to the book. The militants were killed, captured, or driven out. The area was secured, the displaced population returned, their homes were rebuilt, and the civic administration was revived. The army had finally learned the principles of clear, hold, build, and transfer, the mantra of General Petraeus's counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan, and could carry them out when it had the will to do so. In the words of British Ambassador Sherard Cooper Coles, successful stabilization requires strategic stamina, massive resources, lots of time, and plenty of ambition. The militants made several attempts to return, but the army still had 25,000 troops stationed in the valley 2 years later, in the summer of 2011. The important difference between the campaigns in Swat and Fatah was that in Swat the army had no need to differentiate between so-called friendly Taliban and those who were enemies of the state. There was no double game in Swat, no Haqqani's network or local commander such as Hafiz Gul Bahadur to protect. In Fatah, every military offensive had allowed the enemy Taliban to retreat and come under the protection of Afghan or Pakistani Taliban, whom the army supported. Thus, the enemy Taliban had been able to escape from one tribal agency only to re-emerge in another to continue the fight. The Americans hoped that the battle for Swat signaled a shift in the army's attitude, but Kayani still refused to launch an offensive into North Waziristan, where the Haqqani network and their Pakistani Taliban allies were strongest. The Obama administration accelerated a strategic dialogue with the military and the civilian government. Richard Holbrooke set up intensive discussions between all departments of the U.S. government and their Pakistani counterparts. Secretary Clinton conducted a total of 3 ministerial-level meetings with Pakistani officials during 2010, something that had never happened before. The two countries identified 13 sectors, such as energy and education, where the Americans promised help. Military aid was separated from economic aid. On May 6th and 7th, the United States held a trilateral summit in Washington that brought together Presidents Karzai, Zardari, and Obama and General Kayani, where they discussed greater cooperation and laid the groundwork for what would later become a dialogue between Pakistan and Afghanistan on reconciling with the Afghan Taliban. On July 18th, at another ministerial, presided over by Hillary Clinton, Pakistan and Afghanistan signed a transit trade agreement, which would open up bilateral trade across all borders between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. But U.S.-Pakistan relations were still not set to improve over the long term, and the problem once again was dissatisfaction felt by the Pakistan military. At the end of the year, the Enhanced Partnership with Pakistan Act of 2009 was ready to be signed into law. It would give Pakistan's civilian sector $1.5 billion in aid every year for 5 years. The bill, called the Kerry-Lugar-Berman Aid Bill after its major sponsors in Congress, would be a huge boost to the civilian government in Islamabad. In the past, the Americans had frittered aid away in small projects, but Holbrooke was convinced that starting a few mega-projects would show that the United States was involved in Pakistan's economic development. For the first time, the United States, rather than just throwing money at the military, displayed a commitment to a Pakistani civilian government and the democratic process. But the bill carried the conditions that the U.S. president had to affirm every year that Pakistan remained a democracy and continued to help in the war against extremism. It thereby ruled out another military coup or Pakistani favoritism towards some Taliban. At the last minute, Kayani and the army objected to these conditions. They manipulated the Pakistani media to condemn the bill as outrageous interference in Pakistan's domestic affairs. On October 7th, Kayani and his 9 corps commanders expressed serious concern regarding clauses of the bill impacting on national security, and said it was unacceptable. The Pakistani government was bankrupt and surviving on an $11.3 billion loan from the IMF. But President Zardari, rather than defend the bill and stress its importance, once again succumbed to the military. His government condemned the conditions attached to the bill, as did all the political parties. The ISI launched a massive public relations exercise, briefing TV talk show hosts and journalists as well as politicians, encouraging them to whip up anti-American feeling. The U.S. Congress was livid, as was the administration, and particularly Richard Holbrooke, who had staked his reputation on bringing Pakistan closer to the United States. After some haggling, a consensus between the U.S. government and Pakistan was reached, and Congress passed the bill. Nevertheless, the fact that the Pakistan Army could veto even a simple measure such as aid to civilian institutions demonstrated its power to the public and to the international community. The money, after all, would only have helped do what Pakistan's elite had failed to do: set priorities for social reform, energy, education, health, governance, and justice. In the aftermath of the successful SWAT operation, relations between the Pakistan Army and the United States were worsening into mistrust, a harbinger of more to come. Tensions between the United States and Pakistan also escalated over the use of drones. On a trip to Washington, General Pasha, the head of the ISI, had criticized the CIA for not targeting Pakistani Taliban leaders. On August 7th, a U.S. drone fired a missile that killed Baitullah Masood, the leader of the Pakistani Taliban. The missile had caught him and his wife at night on the roof of a house in North Waziristan. 10 others were killed in the house. On August 22nd, a 40-member Shura gathering chose Hakimullah Masood, age 26, a ruthless militant commander, as the new chief of the Pakistani Taliban. When the United States next urged the army to advance into North Waziristan, the army declined, saying it would do so at its own choosing and in its own time. The Pakistani Taliban took brutal revenge for Masood's killing. In October, 9 suicide attacks hit Pakistan's security forces, among them a devastating attack on army headquarters in Rawalpindi on October 10th. The Taliban militants were all Punjabis, and the sole survivor was a former soldier of the Army Medical Corps. On a single day later that month, the Taliban mounted 3 attacks in Lahore, in which 150 people were killed and several hundred were injured. On December 4th, the Taliban struck the army again in Rawalpindi. 4 suicide bombers attacked an army mosque during Friday prayers. 37 people were killed, including 5 senior army officers. The militants in each case seemed to come in under the radar, having inside information as to where to attack and who would be there. The attacks raised embarrassing questions about the army's competence, its intelligence apparatus, and gaps in its chain of command. But no one in the army was held accountable. No one was court-martialed or punished for basic security lapses. Chief of Staff Musharraf, for all his weaknesses, had at least been decisive, punishing or sacking anyone who failed. In contrast, Chief of Staff Kayani's indecisiveness and apparent inability to hold anyone within the army accountable were his biggest weaknesses. When Osama bin Laden was killed and the ISI chief, General Pasha, offered his resignation, Kayani refused to accept it. Ultimately, nobody was punished for bin Laden's 6-year-long presence in Abbottabad. Month after month, the tensions between the United States and Pakistan seemed to grow as their respective intelligence agencies waged a clandestine war. In September, 2 NATO helicopters crossed the border into Kurram Agency and killed 3 FC soldiers, causing relations again to fray. That month, NATO made 2 more air intrusions. In retaliation, Pakistan closed the Khyber Pass to all NATO supply traffic. Hundreds of NATO container trucks and oil tankers were stranded on the Pakistani side of the border, while the ISI encouraged gangs of young men to attack and burn parked NATO trucks across the country, sending a blunt message to the Americans. On October 1st in Shikarpur, in northern Sindh, where there was no Taliban presence, 25 NATO oil tankers were burned to a cinder. 2 days later, dozens of tankers were burned near Islamabad, the capital. The State Department finally apologized to Pakistan, and after 10 days the road was reopened. The large number of U.S. drone attacks, 22 in September alone, twice the largest previous monthly total, also infuriated the military. Obama had secretly ordered this escalation, and now the CIA was carrying out drone strikes without clearance from the Pakistani military, breaking the original Musharraf-era agreement between the CIA and the ISI. General David Petraeus, who commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan, also asked for a stepped-up CIA campaign against militant hideouts in Fatah. Meanwhile, the American Special Forces were carrying out night raids in Afghanistan to kill Taliban commanders and, it soon became apparent, frequently crossing over into Pakistan. Frustration with Pakistan is reaching the boiling point, said Bruce Riedel, the former CIA analyst. The risk that we run here is that at some point we're going to overload the circuit in Pakistan, and they're going to say too much. Petraeus was carrying out a dangerous policy of brinkmanship with Pakistan, as he was desperate to show progress in the war effort and targeted the Haqqanis as his main opponent. Moreover, political deadlines loomed for Petraeus and Obama at the end of a year in which they had to show results, preparing an assessment of the war for Congress and announcing the start of troop withdrawals. The Pakistani Taliban stepped up their attacks, this time on Sufi religious shrines in Lahore, Karachi, Peshawar, and other major cities. A love of saints is part of the Sufi or mystical tradition in Islam. Most Pakistanis are imbued with it. But the militants, with their extremist interpretation of Islam, abhor what they consider saint worship. The government could have used the attacks on the shrines to educate the public about the Taliban threat, but the military was more interested in rallying public support for its standoff against the Americans. After the Army's success in Swat, the United States redoubled its efforts to persuade it to mount offensives in South and North Waziristan. The Army had demonstrated that it was competent, could carry out counterinsurgency, and could persevere once an objective was set, despite taking high losses. This progress is much appreciated, but there is a need now to do more, and the Pakistanis have proved that they can do more, Richard Holbrook told me in August 2009. Army casualties restricted how far Kayani could go in ordering fresh offensives from his troops. There was a growing reluctance to fight a war that was being described in Army officers' messes as America's war. Hyder Mullock, an advisor to the U.S. military, later wrote, "Anti-Americanism, always high, has reached unprecedented levels within the military's ranks, especially amongst junior officers. This is because most young officers are unaware of the past deals their generals have made with the Americans, and some may act independently in the name of national pride against an American incursion into Pakistan to target militants." In the previous decade, the Pakistan Army had suffered considerable losses. Kayani later admitted that between 2002 and 2010, 2,273 Pakistani soldiers had been killed and 6,512 had been injured, while 73 ISI officers had been killed, far higher casualties than those suffered by the Americans or NATO in Afghanistan. These very high losses, along with the penetration of some Army units by militants, fed the anti-Americanism growing in the ranks. Demoralized officers and men were reluctant to continue fighting indefinitely in what they constantly described as America's war, even though the Taliban had killed more Pakistani soldiers than Americans. By contrast, the Taliban in Fatah had a keen sense of protecting themselves against infiltration. They launched a bloody campaign against Pashtun tribal elders who sided with the government or raised anti-Taliban militias. They publicly executed local tribesmen whom they suspected of spying for the Americans or providing intelligence for the drone strikes. Electronic chips guided drone attacks, and anyone caught with a suspicious chip of any kind was immediately killed. Starting in 2004, the Taliban executed more than 1,000 Pashtuns without trial. They also established a centralized system to train dozens, then hundreds of suicide bombers, some as young as 11 years old, for the war fronts in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Suicide bombers could be bought for as little as $4,000, and much of the training was done in North Waziristan. In Afghanistan, the number of IED blasts in 2010 was staggering, 14,661. The main component of the mines and IEDs that the Taliban use is ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which is manufactured in prodigious quantities in Pakistan. The Americans have tried to get the Pakistani government to shut down the factories, but it refuses to oblige, even though IEDs are killing its own soldiers in Fatah. In January 2010, Afghanistan banned the use, storage, or import of the fertilizer, and Afghan security forces have captured truckloads of it coming from Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban have also netted a large war chest through a criminal network of kidnapping for ransom. Prominent Pakistanis who were kidnapped have fetched million-dollar ransoms. The victims are invariably moved to North Waziristan, where they live in Haqqani's camps side by side with Pakistan Army units. The Army has made no more attempt to finish off these criminal networks than it has the fertilizer suppliers. In Washington, the Obama administration debated whether to take a harder line toward Islamabad or to try once more to improve relations. Finally, in November 2009, Obama wrote a letter to Zardari suggesting that if Pakistan were to go into North Waziristan, the two nations could become long-term strategic partners. The letter was hand-delivered by General James L. Jones, the National Security Advisor, who also delivered a warning that the United States would strike anywhere in Pakistan if senior al-Qaeda leaders were discovered. Zardari deferred to the military, and his late reply to Obama was non-committal. In retrospect, Pakistan had lost an opportunity, because it was the last time Obama would offer something more than a threat-filled relationship. When Kayani's 3-year term as army chief was due to expire, the Pakistani government had the option of appointing a new army chief and retiring Kayani. Instead, on July 22, 2010, Zardari and Gilani gave Kayani a 3-year extension. This angered many people, including some army officers, who felt their promotions were now blocked, while others considered Kayani's tenure as chief not particularly successful. Kayani had already given 3 other generals who were about to retire 1-year extensions, and he had given 2 extensions to General Pasha, something that had never been done before. An institution that had once been the byword for accountability now seemed to lack it altogether. Army officers viewed the extensions as sheer favoritism on the part of the army chief. At the time, there were reports that Admiral Mullen had pushed for an extension for Kayani, but Mullen told me later that he had never tried to influence the decision. There is little doubt that his unprecedented extension in service seriously diminished his stature in the armed forces and among the politicians. Kayani felt less secure in ordering his troops into combat against the Taliban. Zardari had only made sure that by extending Kayani's time in office he had rendered any political intervention or coup by Kayani controversial and problematic. He had also ensured that Kayani now owed his extra time in uniform to Zardari's goodwill. In retrospect, the political leadership might well have been better off if it had brought in a new chief who may have improved relations with the United States and redefined Pakistan's attitude toward terrorism. But as it is, Kayani will now remain chief until the end of 2013, by which time he will have been at the center of power for 9 years. In October 2004, he was appointed head of the ISI, a hugely powerful position, and he became army chief in October 2007. Zardari and Gilani see his extension as an insurance policy for their own personal safety and for the survival of the regime. Zardari calculates that because he did Kayani this favor, he will support Zardari's re-election as president in 2013. But Pakistan's history has proved that such assumptions are risky bets, because even the most loyal and subservient army chiefs have turned against their political benefactors when the need has arisen. The government and the army and their relations with the United States underwent another major test with the devastating floods in the summer of 2010. Torrential rains and snowmelt loaded up the country's north-south river system beyond its capacity. The average annual rainfall in KP province is 38 inches, but in 6 days in July, it received 136 inches of rain. A huge wave of water that began in the Swat Valley swept down the narrow rivers and poured into the mighty Indus, on the way, overflooding banks and destroying homes, farmlands, bridges, and roads. When the wall of water reached the flat plains of Sindh, it flooded thousands of miles of farmland. On August 6th, Prime Minister Gilani told the nation that 12 million people were displaced without shelter and that 1,600 had died. In mid-August, the World Food Programme said that 3 million people needed urgent food assistance and that 1/5 of the country, or 62,000 square miles, was underwater, the equivalent of an area stretching from Spain to Holland. By the end of August, the floods had affected 20 million people, or 12% of the population. The public response to help the victims was massive, but the government handled it with enormous incompetence and lack of leadership. Zardari chose this moment to take a vacation, both in London and at his French chateau, Manoir de la Reine Blanche, pictures of which were beamed back on TV to an infuriated public. The army, with help from the UN and from Pakistani and international NGOs, conducted the most effective relief work. Despite opposition in Washington, Richard Holbrooke persuaded the U.S. military to provide 30 helicopters from Afghanistan to airlift survivors and food. The relief effort did much to rehabilitate the army in the eyes of the public, and the Americans also won enormous goodwill. But the antics of Zardari and Gilani hampered their efforts to raise international aid, as Western donor countries demanded economic reforms. Both inside and outside Pakistan, Zardari's appeals for a massive bailout fell on deaf ears. Holbrooke bluntly told the government on August 15th that the world could raise only 25% of what Pakistan needed. It would have to raise the rest itself, through new taxes and reforms. The U.S. Congress needs to know that you are taxing yourself, Holbrooke said repeatedly. On September 19th, representatives of 25 countries, led by U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, and World Bank head Robert Zoellick, met at the United Nations in New York to discuss further aid to Pakistan. Their message was that Pakistan had to do more for itself. A UN appeal to raise $2 billion from the international community for relief work was not even half fulfilled. A year later, new floods hit Sindh that rendered 3 million people homeless. In 2010, the Pakistani Taliban were becoming far more dangerous than even the military reckoned on. The ISI's loss of control over the groups in Fatah is telling. In South Waziristan, a Punjabi militant group kidnapped 2 well-known retired ISI officers, Colonel Sultan Amir Tarar and Khalid Khawaja, both of whom had been involved with the Afghan resistance since the 1980s and had helped train the Taliban, and subsequently executed them for being U.S. spies. The ISI, the Afghan Taliban, and even Jalaluddin Haqqani called for clemency, but the groups ignored them, indicating the military's overall loss of control over the region. The Pakistani Taliban have made it clear that unlike the Afghan Taliban, they are ready to work with al-Qaeda to train Western militants who will carry out attacks in their home countries. The Pakistani Taliban are now not merely trying to overthrow the Pakistan government, they have become part of the global jihad. An Afghan immigrant, Najibullah Zazi, age 25, planned to bomb the New York subway system on the anniversary of 9/11 in 2009. U.S. government surveillance foiled the plot. Zazi had learned to make explosives from the Pakistani Taliban in Fatah. In November 2009, an American Muslim officer, Nidal Malik Hassan, gunned down 13 people at Fort Hood, Texas. On May 2, 2010, Faisal Shahzad, a Pakistani-born U.S. citizen, tried to explode a car bomb in Times Square in New York. Well-to-do and educated, with a father who was a senior officer in the Pakistan Air Force, Shahzad had also learned bomb-making techniques from the Pakistani Taliban in Fatah. The bomb was defused before it exploded. He was caught as he was about to fly out to Pakistan. He had been motivated by U.S. drone strikes in Fatah that were killing innocent civilians. Hillary Clinton warned Pakistan that if any such attack was ever successful, the United States would be forced to act militarily. She further infuriated Islamabad by presciently claiming that officials there knew where Osama bin Laden was hiding. I'm not saying that they're at the highest levels, but I believe that somewhere in this government are people who know where Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda is, where Mullah Omar and the leadership of the Afghan Taliban is, and we expect more cooperation to help us bring to justice, capture, or kill those who attacked us on 9/11. A few days later, on May 28th in Lahore, the Taliban wrought terrible havoc on the Ahmadis, a Muslim minority community. Heavily armed gunmen and suicide bombers attacked 2 of their mosques during Friday prayers and slaughtered 95 Ahmadis. Thereafter, Hakimullah Masood, the Pakistani Taliban leader, warned that he would strike at more U.S. and Pakistani cities. The Pakistan Taliban were morphing from a loose, tribal-based structure into a much more organized and sophisticated organization with links across the country and abroad. The security forces in both Pakistan and Afghanistan were clearly caught unawares. The American focus was increasingly on Lashkar-e-Taiba. Admiral Mullen warned in July, on a trip to Islamabad, that LT had become a very dangerous organization and a significant regional and global threat. He said it was expanding into Afghanistan, adding that the Haqqani group is the most lethal network faced by the U.S. in Afghanistan. In October 2009, U.S. authorities arrested David Headley, a Pakistani-born American citizen who claimed to have worked as an informant and a scout for the 2008 Mumbai attacks on behalf of LT and the ISI. That created a crisis with the United States and India. The Indians accused the ISI of having organized the Mumbai massacre, which Pakistan denied. India filed fresh charges in Indian courts against the LT leader, Hafiz Muhammad Saeed, its military commander, Zakiur Rahman Lakhvi, and 4 others, including 2 Pakistan Army officers allegedly working for the ISI. In another case, filed by relatives of 2 Jewish American victims of the Mumbai massacre, a New York court summoned General Pasha and Hafiz Saeed to answer charges, which both men refused to do. Pasha was angered by the court case, which he saw as a trap laid by the CIA. The ISI retaliated in May 2011 by disclosing the name of the CIA station chief in Islamabad. They got a Fatah-based tribesman to file a lawsuit against the station chief, claiming that he was responsible for drones that killed his relatives. The station chief left Islamabad after receiving death threats. The ISI and the CIA were now fighting in public, an ominous development. The last straw for Kayani and Pasha was probably the release of 92,000 U.S. government documents related to Pakistan and the Afghan war as part of the WikiLeaks disclosures. The classified diplomatic cables and reports in WikiLeaks described in detail Pakistan's support for the Afghan Taliban and Haqqani and the ISI's covert operations. Kayani was already livid at the publication of Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, which showed him and the military in a poor light, while U.S. leaders' analysis of the relationship and Kayani was brutally critical. WikiLeaks also exposed the Pakistan Army's complicity with the United States in the use of drones over Pakistani territory and the Army's ongoing cooperation with the CIA, just as it was trying to convince the public it was getting tough with the Americans. The most damaging cables referred to the political tensions between Kayani and Zardari and exposed Kayani's cynical views about all Pakistani politicians, which the American diplomats had duly reported. WikiLeaks was a public relations disaster for the Army and a personal disaster for Kayani, Pasha, and Zardari. Ultimately, WikiLeaks did not shock the public because it revealed what they had presumed anyway, that the ISI was in bed with the CIA on the drones issue, and that Kayani and the Army held civilian politicians in contempt, and that Zardari was deemed corrupt. Nevertheless, Kayani retaliated in a furious off-the-record briefing to selected Pakistani journalists on November 28, 2010. There he listed the complaints that the people of Pakistan, in reality the Army, had against the United States. These included the following. The United States has a transactional relationship with Pakistan, which is the most bullied ally of the Americans. The United States wants to perpetuate a state of controlled chaos in Pakistan, and the real aim of United States strategy is to denuclearize Pakistan. The last item had become an obsession with the military, and stories bolstering this narrative were constantly being fed to the media. On Afghanistan, Kayani said the United States needs to clearly identify and state the end conditions for its war there, something that the Pakistanis themselves have failed to do. The Americans lack clarity on the end conditions because either they aren't willing to state them or they don't know themselves. Pakistan, he said, is deliberately being kept in the dark regarding peace efforts. He was deeply pessimistic about Afghanistan, declaring that peace may never be complete, there may be no permanent stability, and uncontested power may never establish itself. On relations with India, he said that the people of Pakistan measure the strength of U.S.-Pak relations on the scale of the U.S.-India partnership. Although Pakistan cannot afford to be in perpetual conflict with India, he said, it has to strike a balance between defense and development. India remains the devil, as far as the Army is concerned. This briefing, the most candid one Kayani ever gave, led to a storm of protest by U.S. and Western diplomats in Islamabad when its contents were reported. The fact that the Army chief was already so hostile to the United States, and his mindset so rigid regarding India and Afghanistan, made a collapse of relations with the U.S. inevitable. Bin Laden's killing in Abbottabad would be the torch that set the relations ablaze. On December 13th, 2 weeks after Kayani spoke, Richard Holbrooke, the one man in the State Department who could have prevented a breakdown in U.S.-Pakistan relations, died of a burst aorta. It was sadness personified, but perhaps fitting that he was spared having to see his dream of crafting a new U.S.-Pakistan relationship sink into the weeds in the months ahead. Holbrooke had been trying to enlist Pakistan as a friend, rather than an enemy. But he, too, understood perfectly that Pakistan's strategic policies had to change. Chapter 8. Pakistan. Broken Relations, Crimes and Misdemeanors. As of fall 2011, relations between the United States and Pakistan are utterly breaking down, even as the levels of violence escalate in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The two countries' differing interests collide daily. While the United States asks for the elimination of all terrorist groups on Pakistani soil, the army insists on maintaining the Taliban and the Haqqani network until a suitable Afghan settlement has been reached that satisfies the Pakistani military. Neither side sees a way to bridge the widening strategic and ideological gap. Much more is needed than just Admiral Mullen landing in Islamabad, holding the hand of General Kayani, and urging him to do more. Each crisis has inflicted more damage, weakened the relationship, and added another layer of complication to already fraught ties, wrote Pakistan's former ambassador to Washington, Malia Lodi. Once described as strategic, relations seemed to have slipped from being transactional to coercive. At the heart of the crisis lay the divergence between the two countries over the appropriate strategy for Afghanistan. The United States intent on waging more war, even as it declared its desire to move towards a negotiated peace, and Pakistan wanting a de-escalation of kinetic activity to pave the way for peacemaking. Meanwhile, Pakistan was still unwilling to do anything about the safe havens. Pakistani officials said that the sanctuaries were a consequence, not the cause of the insurgency, and they were right when they criticized the mishandling of the policy in Afghanistan by the United States over the years. The Pakistani military has failed to notice that its options are becoming fewer as the country subsides into chaos, and it fails to grasp that U.S. unilateralism will necessarily increase, in the shape of military actions and possibly sanctions to degrade the Taliban and the Haqqani network. Instead, Pakistan's generals bury their heads in the sand and pretend no such threat will materialize, and that the brinkmanship they pursue with the Americans can continue indefinitely. Their position is that if they cannot get what they want out of an Afghan settlement, nobody will get an Afghan peace. Blinded by ideology, they resist any forward-looking strategic thinking. Pakistan's military does not want to deliver peace except on its own terms. Its civilians have no hope for reform without it. The ISI should be under no illusion it will be able to influence, much less control, anything in post-American Afghanistan, wrote Ayaz Amir. Even as they wished the Americans would leave Afghanistan, the Army also wanted them to stay because of the cash cow Washington had become for the military. The Army receives more than $2 billion every year in various kinds of military aid from the United States, and losing that could prove to be destabilizing in the Army itself. But it was clear even in 2009 that the economic crisis in the West would determine how long Western forces would stay on. The United States, too, lacks a strategic vision for Afghanistan and the region that it could share or discuss with Pakistan. Nobody knows what the Americans want in the long term. Will they leave in 2014? Or will they turn Afghanistan into the new South Korea, with bases and thousands of troops stationed there permanently? The Americans appear to have made little effort to calculate the repercussions of unilateral military action, that Pakistan could become even more belligerent, and that a final rupture could take place. At times, both sides seem to have an underlying death wish. Both have had enough of the relationship, both are defiant, yet each needs the other. Neither wants to revive the relationship under false pretenses, yet neither can muster enough vision or assume enough responsibility to discuss a new paradigm. At times, each side convinces itself that it can do without the other, which of course is wishful thinking. For Pakistan and its elite, much more is at stake than worsening relations with the United States. A huge internal crisis, economic, social, religious, and political, that has been building since Musharraf's time is erupting. A particularly troubling sign is the escalating intolerance of non-Muslim minorities, an index of the rapid deterioration in the very idea of Pakistan. When Jinnah founded the country, the white stripe down the side of Pakistan's green flag represented the minorities or non-Muslims, whom the majority Muslim population would protect and treat as equal citizens, Yet Christians who can afford to do so are now leaving the country in droves because of their persecution. The Ahmadis, a Muslim minority sect, have been relentlessly persecuted by the state and the mullahs alike. The Ismailis, a Shia sect led by the Aga Khan, have seen their professional and business class targeted by extremists. These groups, mainstream Shias and the few Hindus, are all trying to leave the country. In 2010 and 2011, Sunni extremists killed more than 500 Shias, many of them Hazaras from Afghanistan, who live peacefully in Baluchistan province. The extremists want to redefine the state of Pakistan as an Islamic jihadist venture, and for that they must create an atmosphere of total intolerance. Ayaz Amir wrote, "In our journey towards nationhood, we eschewed the rational and chose instead to play with the semantics of religion. What Pakistan has become today, a fortress not so much of Islam as of bigotry and intolerance, is a fruit of these sustained endeavors." The most immediate issue is the controversial and outdated law on blasphemy, which many in the ruling Pakistan People's Party want to reform. The law is a catch-22 because it allows anyone to charge anyone else with blasphemy, which leads to automatic arrest by the police. Yet the charge or proof of it can never be named because it is blasphemous. At any given time, more than 1,000 people are in jail on charges of blasphemy, some Christian but many Muslims. The loudest voice for amending the law was that of Salman Taseer, the outspoken governor of the largest province, Punjab. On January 4, 2011, he was gunned down in Islamabad. His own bodyguard, Malik Mumtaz Qadri, a policeman from the Punjab elite force, shot him 27 times in the back and head. Other bodyguards refused to shoot Qadri dead, as he surrendered and declared he had carried out a virtuous act. The massive public acclaim that the killer received shocked millions of Pakistanis and was a watershed for the country. As the killer went to jail, he was applauded and garlanded, and 500 lawyers pledged to defend him in court. No Maulvi, prayer leader in a mosque in Lahore, would read Taseer's funeral prayers. The country's rulers were too frightened to come to Taseer's funeral. For the first time, the silent majority of Pakistanis, who had never been extremists, never supported the Taliban, and never voted for the religious right, seemed either to be shifting their stance or to be too frightened to react. Rather than take a stand, the government bent over backward to appease the extremists, saying that it had no intention of reviewing the blasphemy law, which it had actually promised to do. Gilani forced Sherry Rahman, a leading PPP liberal politician, to withdraw her amendment bill in Parliament. Then on March 2nd, gunmen shot dead Shahbaz Bhatti in Islamabad. He was the PPP Minister for Minorities and the only Christian in the federal cabinet. Outraged political leaders from around the world, including Pope Benedict, demanded that the government protect Christians and withdraw the blasphemy law. In the meantime, extremists targeted shrines of the Sufi saints, which the vast majority of Muslims deeply revere. In 2011, every symbol of moderate Islam in Pakistan since its founding is under attack. Baluchistan, Pakistan's poorest and most neglected province, is home to an insurgency, as radical but secular Baluch leaders demand separation from Pakistan. The Baluch tribes have rebelled against the Pakistan Army 5 times since 1947, but each time the insurgency has been put down brutally. That has only further alienated the Baluch, while their political and economic grievances remained unaddressed. In August 2006, the army killed Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti, a powerful tribal chief and politician, and 30 of his men, which triggered a wider insurgency. When Zardari came to power in 2008, he promised reconciliation talks with the Baluch militants, but there has been no follow-up and no talks, and the insurgency has become more violent. The fighting has been low-key but brutal. While Baluch militants have targeted the security forces with ambushes, assassinations, and landmines, they have also killed non-Baluch settlers, including teachers, shopkeepers, and bureaucrats. Non-Baluch have fled the province. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have described a kill-and-dump policy, by which the security forces pick up, detain, torture, and kill Baluch nationalists, activists, and ordinary civilians and students. Their bullet-ridden bodies are dumped on the roadside at a rate of about 20 a month. In October 2010, Amnesty International issued a damning report demanding that the government investigate the torture and killings of more than 40 Baluch leaders and political activists over the past 4 months. Human Rights Watch says that hundreds of Baluch have disappeared since 2005. Often their bodies are not even found. This is not counterinsurgency, it is barbarism, and it needs to end now, says Brad Adams, the group's Asia director. The military has long demanded that the U.S. government place Baluch insurgent groups on the State Department's list of terrorist groups, which the United States has declined to do, noting that the Baluch have not targeted anyone outside the region. Increasingly, the Pakistani military has viewed the Baluch insurgency through the myopic lens of the Indian presence in Afghanistan, rather than treating it as a political issue. Pakistan claims that the RAW, India's intelligence agency, is arming and funding the Baluch insurgents from Indian consulates in Afghanistan. As early as 2007, former President Musharraf told the Americans that a hostile India was arming the Baluch from Kabul. India denies the charge. In all past Baluch insurgencies, India has had a hand in providing some level of support, usually money for the insurgents, in a tit-for-tat return for Pakistan's support for Kashmiri militants. There is every reason to suspect that India is also involved in this insurgency, possibly providing money to Baluch insurgent leaders who are living in Europe and the Gulf Emirates. However, these facts still do not deter the Baluch from their central position that they have been poorly treated, their grievances have not been addressed, and there is no political process by which they can be heard in the corridors of power in Islamabad. Some Baluch militants have taken refuge in Afghanistan. In 2009, the Afghan Interior Minister, Hanif Atmar, admitted that some 500 Baluch and Sindhi dissidents were living in a refugee camp in Kandahar, but said they were not allowed to carry out any hostile act against Pakistan. Pashtuns inhabit Baluchistan's border with Afghanistan, and it is here, and in the capital Quetta, that the Taliban have their homes, mosques, madrasas, businesses, and training camps. Most of the Taliban leaders have families living in or around Quetta, under constant monitoring by the ISI. The Taliban have been careful to maintain excellent relations with the Baluch and have refused to get involved in the civil war in Baluchistan. The disappearances of hundreds of people by the intelligence agencies and in Baluchistan, even by military units such as the Frontier Corps, are a reflection of the utter failure of the judiciary. The judiciary is a broken instrument, incapable of handing down judgments to the real criminals. A U.S. State Department report says that in Pakistan, 3 in 4 defendants on terrorism charges are acquitted, either because the prosecutors lack proof or because the judges are intimidated. The failure of the courts has frustrated the military, which has increasingly taken the law into its own hands, summarily jailing or executing not just anti-state terrorists, but any political opponents of the army or the ruling party. The city of Karachi is another fast-burning fuse that could detonate the entire country. Karachi is an extraordinary metropolis, one of the great economic engines of South Asia, holding the country's major port, its stock market, and more than half its industry. Its 18 million people generate 70% of the country's revenue and 30% of its GDP. But every year, its ethnic melting pot, the majority Mohajir community, who are settlers from India, Pashtun and Baluch tribesmen, Punjabi businessmen, and smaller groups from all over South Asia, is mired in ethnic violence. Mafias, criminal gangs, car thieves, and Taliban and sectarian extremists all carry out their turf wars and protection rackets. The kinds of violence witnessed in Karachi are seen nowhere else in Pakistan. Targeted mass killings, and torture using electric drills. Victims' heads, genitals, and limbs are severed, stuffed into sacks, and dropped on the road. Every year since the 2009 election, an average of 1,200 people have been killed. An orgy of violence erupted in the summer of 2011. 300 people were killed just in July. The political parties of the ethnic groups lead the fight. The main conflict is between the Pashtuns, represented by the Awami National Party, the Mohajirs, led by Altaf Hussain, who has headed the Mutahida Qawmi movement, or MQM, from exile in London for the past 20 years.